Nobody knew that Roosevelt's victory in 1932 would bring in a new political era, what we call the New Deal era, an era of much greater government responsibility for the health of the economy, for support for labor unions, passing the most far-reaching governmental welfare policies in American history, the Social Security Act, especially the Wages and Hours Act, and so forth. Also creating jobs during the 1930s for a lot of unemployed. And of course, this election became pivotal because Roosevelt kept on winning. If he had left office in 1936 and not been reelected in 1936, a lot of what we think of as the New Deal era would not have taken place. And this would not have, the 1932 election would not be seen as a very pivotal election. But because Roosevelt was elected in 36 and elected again in 40 and 44, he was able to consolidate a lot of the policies that he was just thinking about rather vaguely, to be honest, in 1932, and had not really talked about them very much in his campaign at that year. The next pivotal election, I think, was 1980. And this was a reversal, in many ways, of the 1932 election, in the sense that the 1932 election had brought in this regime, if you will, of the New Deal order, Democratic coalition in the cities and to some degree in the South, really controlling the country from 1932 until into the 1970s. By 1980, as most of you probably know, Ronald Reagan was elected over Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not a very thoroughgoing New Deal liberal. It's often true at the end of one political order that even the standard bearer of the party, which is most identified with that order, as Jimmy Carter was a Democrat, is no longer willing or able or eager to stand up for the principles that sort of founded that order. And that was true for Jimmy Carter, who was a rather conservative Democrat. But most Democrats were still liberals, still saw the politics of the political positions of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson as ones that should be followed, should be revived if necessary. And Ronald Reagan brought a stop to that. Reagan brought into power a new conservative coalition. He won over a lot of Democratic votes, especially in the South, but also in parts of the North. And it's really from 1980 on that we can talk about a conservative era in American politics, which may be ending. But as a historian, I'm a little reluctant to say it is ending. But certainly there are signs that it may be ending, which I can talk about. But Reagan's victory brought in new ideas, too, about how government should be used. That government should be used to aggressively to combat communism and to combat any enemies of the United States in the world, but it should not be used to help those who cannot, who are unwilling to help themselves. So a lot of the welfare policies put into place in the 1930s and 1960s, Reagan was opposed to. He didn't actually succeed in doing away with them, but he rhetorically was opposed to them. And the benefit of the doubt in American politics from 1980 really till the present has been on those who would oppose government programs, who would oppose what Reagan called throwing money at problems, rather than being on the side of liberals who, before the 1980s, really did want to help as many Americans as possible. So you really went from what, in European terms, or perhaps even in Asian terms, would be considered a social democratic regime under the New Deal and Kennedy and Johnson, to a center-right regime under Reagan and his successors, including Bill Clinton, by the way, who is a Democrat, of course, and many people think is a liberal, but whose policies in many ways were more conservative than those of Richard Nixon, who was a Republican. And I can go into that if you're interested. But Bill Clinton was a more conservative president than Richard Nixon, in domestic affairs at least. Well, it's possible, but again, as a historian, I'm reluctant to say for sure that the 2000 election can also be seen as an important watershed. Why? I think because of the war in Iraq. Now, you can say, well, the war in Iraq didn't start in 2000. It started in 2003. But it's quite possible that if Al Gore had been elected, and some people say he was elected, in 2000, instead of George Bush, that the response to the attacks of September 11, 2001, that Al Gore would have made would have been quite different from the very aggressive response by George W. Bush and his advisors. And one could argue that just as the Vietnam War and the Civil War helped to end political eras, that the Iraq War may be seen as ending the conservative era as well. And then the election of 2000 will be seen kind of ironically, because of course the man who won could be seen as, in the end, the loser, and his party and his ideology as the loser, could be seen as a pivotal election. As important as the ones I've mentioned before, I'm not sure. But certainly the war in Iraq, as badly as it's gone, has made a lot of Americans question a lot of the conventional wisdom that Ronald Reagan brought into the White House, and that seemed to dominate American politics over the last 25, 27 years. And if that's true, then in an ironic way, the 2000 election will be seen as a pivotal election as well, I think. The Iraq War is obviously right now the leading issue, but one of the things that helped the Democrats, as you probably know, to win control of Congress last year, an issue which has been gaining in importance for a lot of Americans, I think, is this issue of, it's been called the wage gap, economic inequality, comes out in debates about free trade, for example, which of course, you know, is very important to the relationship between U.S. and Korea. A lot of so-called Reagan Democrats, people who voted for Republican candidates, even though they might have still been registered as Democrats for a long time, 1980s, some of the 1990s, certainly in 2000 and 2004, are now turning their backs on the Republican Party. These are people, mostly white, lower middle class and working class people in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Missouri,